This is a brief explainer of the situation in Sudan and the terrible humanitarian crisis there, which has been going on for about 70 years. Let's begin. From 1899 to the very end of 1955, Sudan existed as a territory jointly administrated by Egypt and Britain, although, a big surprise here, it was really Britain doing the ruling. Then, Sudan was both Sudans of today, as well as parts of modern Libya. In 1952, there was an anti-imperialist revolution in Egypt, essentially forcing Britain into what was likely already inevitable, letting Sudan become independent, which it did on January the 1st, 1956. The First Sudanese Civil War began in August of 1955, between the government in Khartoum, which mostly controlled the north, and the Anyanya rebels in the south. The north and south of the country were divided in terms of religion, ethnicity, and exposure to Western ideas. The north was and is primarily composed of Arabs and Muslims, the south predominantly black, and Christian or animist, and from the very conception of independence, the scales of power vastly disfavored the south. In 1958, there was a coup. In 1964, there was a revolution. In 1969, there was another coup, all while the civil war continued until 1972, by which time it had claimed the lives of between 500,000 and 1 million people. The Addis Ababa Agreement ended the war with the South, remaining part of Sudan, but being given a fair degree of autonomy. In the early 80s, the North, the central government, sought to control numerous newly discovered oil fields along the north-south border, violating the Addis Ababa Agreement on more than one occasion. With this and growing power among Islamic fundamentalists in the north, 1983 saw President Nimeri declare the entire country an Islamic state and the Addis Ababa Agreement over. You could have your hands or feet amputated or be stoned to death, starting the Second Sudanese Civil War.
So you think President Nimeri is a great man?
I don't think he's great. He's the greatest president in the whole world.
Tribal divisions have been exacerbated and exploited in this war. It's no longer just a north-south conflict, but southerner pitted against southerner.
It's been an honor and a pleasure to welcome President Nimeri to Washington once again.
The government gave weapons to this tribe, but the rebel SPLA and their tribal allies proved too strong.
We applaud the Sudan's efforts to reinvigorate its private sector and reform governmental policies that hinder economic progress.
And then they burn our houses and kill our women and children, even people.
Of course, it was a very depressing picture.
We know where the rebels are, who they are, we know them.
These are so-called rebel civilians at the rebel famine camp in Narus.
In 1985, there was another coup, marking the end of the Democratic Republic of Sudan and the start of the Republic of Sudan. And then in 1989, can you guess? The RCC, or Revolutionary Command Council for National Salvation, came into power as a military junta run by Colonel, then General, Omar Hassan al-Bashir. They imposed their religious values on the rest of the country and purged much of the army and police of dissenters and non-Muslims.
Opposition is suppressed, political parties are banned, and newspapers are censored. Many others aren't even this fortunate, held in so-called ghost houses, run by the security forces. There, the allegation is, most inmates are tortured. The claims are made by Amnesty International, who say there are gross violations of human rights.
Now, Fasher also defended a recent YouTube video of a Sudanese woman being flogged by policemen who were enforcing Sharia law.
There are many, many remarkable examples. Women getting flogged because they wore jeans. People getting their hands cut off because they stole cooking oil. Under the regime, women were incredibly oppressed, especially in the north, and they were treated more as a commodity than people. In the north, it was not uncommon for both men and women to be killed for apostasy. China supplied the Sudanese government with weaponry and even deployed troops to protect Sudanese oil fields. The rebels were at times armed by Ethiopia, Eritrea, Uganda, Israel, and early on, East Germany. Ethnic violence was widespread, with both government forces and the Sudanese People's Liberation Army attacking civilians, killing prisoners, and committing a litany of atrocities, all while smaller factions, often born out of necessity, fought their own civil wars, some starting out as militias and becoming brutal paramilitaries. Both the government and the rebels constantly purged their own ranks of dissent, torturing and murdering people without reprieve, and both the government and SPLA and other minor factions extensively used child soldiers.
The child soldiers have not only taken part in active combat, they also worked as spies, porters, messengers, lookouts, and sex slaves, causing severe psychological trauma.
They killed the cattle and the children with Antonovs. Then they burned all the houses. The Arabs tell us, we don't want you here. We will take your land and your property and drive you out.
After 17 years of this, both sides were pretty exhausted, although not so exhausted they were ready to crumble. Anywhere between 1 and 2 million had died in the war, mostly due to starvation or drought. In 2005, a peace agreement was agreed in Nairobi, giving the south of the country autonomy for 6 years, with an agreed independence referendum after that. In 2011, South Sudan did indeed secede. From the beginning, it faced armed opposition in 9 out of its 10 states, organized gangs, armed militias, religious extremists. Ethnic violence has continued and made these conflicts difficult to conclusively resolve. From the start, the SPLA, now in control of their own country, led by President Salva Kiir Mayardit, consolidated power and brutalized the population. Mayardit's regime still controls South Sudan, and over the last 14 years has killed political rivals, whether they be critics, generals, or journalists.
And in South Sudan, the reality is you're either a loyalist or you're not. And if you're not, you're in peril. The government has instilled or undertaken a campaign of terror in the country to displace, kill, rape, loot, and destroy civilian property.
From 2013 to 2020, the SPLA fought a bloody civil war with the SPLM-IO, the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement, in opposition. As of 2025, South Sudan has a population of not quite 13 million. The civil war has displaced 4 million, with at least 1.5 million fleeing the country entirely. At least 400,000 people have died in the war, according to estimates made before it was even over in 2018, and of those 400,000, it's believed at least 40,000 were children. Mayardit is still the president of South Sudan. He has overseen massacres. Massacres where a few hundred people are arrested, put into a room, and shot. He has overseen ethnic cleansing, disregarded famine, used his people not only with callous disregard, but maybe even malicious disregard for their lives. In South Sudan, during the highest point of the conflict, more than 27 out of every 100 children didn't make it to 5 years old. And now, in peacetime, that number is still 1 in 10. 1 in every 50 pregnancies in South Sudan results in the death of the mother. Before the South seceded, what was once North Sudan, now just Sudan, found itself embroiled in a conflict with the SPLM-N, the Sudanese People's Liberation Movement North, which conducted an insurgency mostly in Sudan's southern Blue Nile and South Kordofan states. At the same time as this, the Sudanese government continued what is known as the War in Darfur, which started in 2003. These sort of became the same war, at least very entwined, although the South Kordofan and Blue Nile War was far less bloody. That displaced 500,000 people and killed thousands. The war in Darfur killed around 300,000 people, again mostly from malnutrition and disease caused by the war. Violence against civilians, war crimes, crimes against humanity were committed by numerous parties, not least the Sudanese government. They coordinated with and supplied weapons and money to the Janjaweed, an ethnically segregated militia, or perhaps more accurately, affiliated militias. They, with the Sudanese government, carried out ethnic cleansing against non-Arab people across the region. In 2013, al-Bashir announced that the Janjaweed, which al-Bashir heavily relied on to wage war on unarmed civilians, would be reorganized into the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces.
The United Nations accuses the Sudanese government of being behind the Janjaweed and of helping organize the violence. The government denies this. One of the officers, Jafna al-Bakhit, says he was recruited by the government. So how are you recruited? He says at the start of the conflict, government recruiters went around Arab neighborhoods, promising rewards for those who took up arms against the rebels. There was a rush to join.
A 2014 report by the Swiss group Small Arms Survey found that 58% of conventional weapons imported by the Sudanese government were from China, with 13% supplied by Iran, 9% supplied by St. Vincent and the Grenadines, surely a conduit for someone else, and 8% supplied by Ukraine. By 2019, Sudan's economy was on its knees, with fuel shortages, a tripling in the price of bread, and a collapse in currency, leading to widespread protests that ultimately became a revolution. Facing massive public pressure, al-Bashir's own chief of staff ordered him arrested. General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan became Sudan's head of state in April 2019. He somewhat loosened the authoritarian grip of the Sudanese government and aimed to stabilize the country at first. Despite making promises of guiding Sudan to a democratic civilian government, in June, al-Burhan used the Sudanese Armed Forces and the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, to crush protests in Khartoum. They killed more than 100 people, although with an internet blackout at the time and with bodies thrown into the Nile, that number could be far greater. The RSF is explicitly implicated in the rapes of at least 70 people just from this single incident. This in a response to a sit-in. So, with roots, and really more than just roots, in the Janjaweed militias, the Rapid Support Forces were officially established in 2013. Since its inception, it has committed the most heinous war crimes and crimes against humanity imaginable. It is led, and has always been led, by Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo Musa.
Hamdan's men are accused of carrying out atrocities while allied to the government. Yet publicly, the powers in Khartoum have disowned them. He said he wanted to put the record straight. He said that in fact the government recruited him personally to fight against the Darfur rebels in 2003 and made his men part of the armed forces.
After the April coup, in May, Musa went to visit Mohammed bin Salman, the butcher of Saudi Arabia. Both the war in Darfur and the insurgency across the Blue Nile and South Kordofan states ended on August the 31st, 2020, and in October of 2021, al-Burhan led a coup against his own government, essentially establishing himself as total ruler. This led to a furthering of Sudan's perennial economic crisis and even more protests. After this, the RSF began building up its infrastructure and manpower across the country, especially in Khartoum. The RSF and Musa wanted to retain as much control for as long as possible, resisting the junta's demands that they be integrated into the armed forces in 2 years. In April of 2023, the RSF mobilized, and what's often known as the Sudanese Civil War, but you might call the Third Sudanese Civil War, broke out. By the end of the year, the government forces, or the SAF, the Sudanese Armed Forces, were on the back heel, facing critical shortages of supply. They lost numerous important cities and most of Khartoum, but in 2024, the SAF slowed the RSF and countered in some places. In early 2025, they retook Khartoum city, and then in mid-2025, they cleared much of Khartoum state of the RSF. As of this video, made in November 2025, the war continues, with the death toll hard to estimate. Science.org, in this article from February, points out that there is a huge range of estimates of the number of dead, from 20 to 150,000. The numbers all obscured by a lack of access and, frankly, the absence of people to count the dead because they're dead. Satellite imagery shows entire villages burned to the ground, hospitals demolished, and numerous signs of the massacre of civilians. As of making this video in early November, there is a massacre occurring right now in Fasher, with hundreds of hospital patients and staff murdered where they stood, and more reports of wholesale executions coming through as I fucking write, read, and edit this.
Somehow one of them, sitting on a bench, has survived what looks to be a massacre. Casually, the gunman raises his rifle and shoots him. With another fighter, he strolls around their victims, making sure no one is left alive.
In 2024, Amnesty International reported that weapons were entering Sudan from China, Russia, Turkey, Yemen, the UAE, and Serbia. China has been strategically invested in Sudan for decades and still controls 40% of the Greater Nile Petroleum Operating Company. It has thus far avoided being drawn further into the conflict and surely does not care who wins as long as it can keep pumping oil. Russia has supplied weaponry to both sides, with Russia's Wagner paramilitary funneling large amounts of munitions to the RSF, but it seems that the Kremlin has more recently begun to favour the SAF, although that's according to US channels as of September. The gutting of US aid in the first half of 2025 forced 80% of emergency food kitchens in Sudan to shut down. It's estimated that worldwide, US aid's closure will contribute to 14 million deaths, and with 60% of Sudan's 50 million people malnourished, it's likely the Sudanese will be a significant chunk of that grim number. According to data from the UN, US aid provided 44% of the world's humanitarian funding in 2024 for Sudan. The war, like so many others, is something of a proxy war, in this case between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. At times the RSF have had 40,000 troops fighting the Houthis in Yemen on behalf of the UAE. Musa keeps most of his wealth, all stolen of course, in Dubai. The UAE have undoubtedly backed the RSF with weapons, vehicles, ammunition, and it seems likely troops, or at least advisors, as well. Some experts said, in a Guardian article from 2024, that if the UAE were not involved, the war would already be over. Despite having met him in 2019, and no doubt having had a wonderful time, this puts Musa in opposition to MBS. Saudi Arabia has denied providing Sudanese government forces with financial or military aid, but they almost certainly have done just that. Surely, most likely as part of a regional struggle over influence between itself and the UAE. So I have to wonder if this is where the chips really fall. In 2024, the UK government was accused of trying to dissuade other states from criticising the UAE, specifically over its support for the RSF. Of course, they deny that they did that, but it's worth pointing out that the UAE has connections with many British top hatters, including Mr. Brexit himself and the husband of one of Britain's richest women, Mr. David Cameron. The UAE and Saudi Arabia may be rivals, if not indirect enemies, but they're both important to Western, read American, designs on Africa. Basically, they are both useful in rebuffing some of China's interests in the region. While in the last 50 years it's generally believed that the US has invested less in Africa than China, the UAE has invested a lot in Africa. On behalf of Unky Sam, perhaps. I have to wonder if the equation isn't this. The Sudanese people are not particularly valuable. We've got people here, people there, so many people aren't worth much at all. That's just, supply and demand. Loads of people. What's worth more than a bunch of people are geopolitical allies, and the only way not to go against one of them is to stay out of it. Let them have their punching match where nothing will be achieved, and forget about it. It's just Sudan. Who cares? What's happening in Sudan is normal people are trapped between two warring factions that are both utterly despicable, both ruled by psychopathic murderers. And more recently, those two factions have become, to an extent, the proxies of much richer nations. And those nations are, to an extent, the proxies of even richer nations. Us. If the international community were actually interested in justice or keeping innocent people safe, they would have intervened a long time ago, probably before I was born. That's not actually the focus. Peace in Sudan, real lasting peace, probably requires the deployment of a large, willful peacekeeping force that will have to impose peace. And that, inevitably, will be politically and economically costly, with no benefits, other than doing what's right, but when's that mattered? There are things that people can do. They can make noise, they can talk to their politician, all the usual, all the hits. But I worry that the needs of realpolitik far outweighs the demands of what is right. As always. But we can try. That's really all we can do. Fuck.